Good afternoon. Thank you for your patience. The Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa and Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the current state of U.S. policy toward UN peacekeeping missions and the future of peacekeeping operations in Africa. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Last weekend, 30 people were killed in attacks in central Mali. Over 120 armed groups operate in eastern DRC, causing record displacement of civilians, and the Wagner Group is committing atrocities and dominates state institutions in the Central African Republic. These are all countries where multi-year, multi-billion-dollar peacekeeping missions are or were recently deployed. Today's hearing is as much about the future of peacekeeping as it is about the reality of growing insecurity across the African continent. The failing of these peacekeeping missions leaves African countries with few alternatives. This has resulted in increased reliance on private military companies or bilateral deployment agreements with fellow African countries. These PMCs cover a spectrum from Wagner's neo-colonial model that trades in violence and uses blood gold to fund Putin's war in Ukraine, to responsible companies, including American PMCs that provide essential security and logistics services at U.S. embassies. I would like to better understand what is being done to kneecap Wagner's influence on the continent, where countries are looking for immediate solutions, and how the administration is approaching countries that want to engage responsible PMCs. These bilateral agreements, showcased by the successful deployments of Rwandan troops to Mozambique and the Central African Republic, demonstrate that African governments are taking security measures into their own hands. I look forward to hearing how the Department of State's Global Peace Operations Initiatives develops the critical mission capabilities of partner countries. In December, the government of Ghana demonstrated great leadership in advancing a successful United Nations Security Council resolution that would see Africa take greater ownership of its security by allowing resources to be redirected from the United Nations to African Union-led security missions. This is a significant development and a departure from long-standing U.S. policy that spans administrations. I look forward to the testimony of how this resolution will be operationalized to overcome the bureaucratic obstacles at the United Nations. I have concerns that this policy change may exist in a silo here in Washington and New York and not become a reality on the ground in countries such as Mali, Central African Republic, and the DRC. It is clear from my engagements with African governments that they share my concerns around how this new framework will operate in practice. Specifically, 75% funding cap, which was the result of a successful U.S.-led amendment, has raised questions of where the additional 25% of funding for these missions will come from. The African Union's Peace Fund has yet to reach its $400 million fundraising goal, which in itself is barely enough to fund 1 year of a modest-sized deployment. Additionally, the absence of any major African-led peace operation to address the recent conflicts in Ethiopia and Sudan illustrates the AU's limited intervention capabilities and the absence of a standard institutionalized playbook being adopted by the AU and regional economic communities for why, when, and how they engage in these missions. The U.S. taxpayer is asked each year to support payments to the United Nations for peacekeeping missions that are increasingly viewed as irrelevant or worse to the national interests of these countries where they are mandated to restore peace and security. The future of these peacekeeping missions is the billion-dollar question, and I look forward to the discussion today as we consider alternatives that may prove a greater success. I now recognize my ranking member, Ms. Sarah Jacobs from California. Ms. Jacobs, for any statement you may have.
Thank you, Chairman James, Assistant Secretary, Assistant Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Pratt, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild. I'm really excited to be having this hearing in front of both of our subcommittees today on the future of UN peacekeeping in sub-Saharan Africa. As our world faces increased and increasing conflict, it's important to re-examine the tools we have at our disposal to protect civilians, stabilize countries after conflicts, and implement peace processes and democratic transitions, but also the tools we have to prevent conflicts before they arise in the first place. UN peacekeeping remains an incredibly important tool to tackle these complex challenges, from the DRC to South Sudan to Central African Republic and beyond, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for new tools. In December, I was glad to see the UN Security Council pass a resolution laying out a framework for partial funding of African Union-led peace support operations with UN-assessed contributions. I think it is an incredible opportunity to instill a whole-of-government response that actually addresses the drivers of violence and centers African people. And I commend the Biden administration for the really critical work securing language on human rights standards, burden sharing, and being accountable to the UN Security Council. But as the UN supports future missions, we need to craft them in a way that builds on the lessons from UN peacekeeping missions and gives them the best chance of success. That means ensuring the human rights standards at the AU reflect the UN standards and are effectively implemented during operations. We know that security forces abuses and human rights violations are some of the biggest drivers of violent extremism. That's why we need to make sure AU peace operations uphold human rights standards to maintain their legitimacy and to prevent them feeding into the very extremism they're aiming to curb. We also need to make sure that AU missions are structured to make sure there is a coherent political strategy to address the root causes of conflict, improve early warning and rapid response systems, and plan for transitions earlier, all challenges that UN peacekeeping missions have faced. But let's also be clear, while there is lots of room for improvement, the evidence is strong. Decades of academic research has shown UN peacekeepers prevent conflict better and cheaper than the alternatives. So if we want to give these missions the best shot at success, if we do care about security and the future of the African continent, we need to properly resource and prioritize UN peacekeeping at the highest diplomatic levels. And we know the United States is best positioned to do this when we are at the table and fully paying our dues. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today about what the United States is doing to further our priorities in these missions, how we consider lessons from the past several years to better address conflict, protect civilians, and bring about peace. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, the congressman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, for any statement he may have.
Thank you very much, Chairman James, and it's great to be working side by side with your committee and our committee on this very, very important issue, so thank you for that. I do want to thank our two very distinguished witnesses today, Michele Sison, for her leadership, and it's very, very long-standing. I would point out on an issue that's very dear and near to my heart on combating human trafficking. She was the first ambassador of the year in counter trafficking. I think it was in 2006. So what a great commitment you've had for all these years. So thank you for that, and welcome to Jonathan Pratt as well to the committee. Over the past several decades, I've held a long series of hearings on accountability for peacekeepers. Obviously, peacekeepers have an extraordinarily hard job. Many give their lives in the service of trying to protect the innocent and the weak and the vulnerable. Sometimes they're given horrific rules of engagement, as they were in South Sudan. I remember visiting the peacekeepers there, and they had almost no rules of engagement. I came back and went and met with Condoleezza Rice and said, what are we doing? We're paying them $1 a day, and that's what they were getting. And they've got rules of engagements that will put their lives and the lives of those that they're dedicated to protect at grave risk. So there's sometimes it comes from the very top, it comes from governments, it comes from the chain of command, and the guy or the woman at the bottom who's doing the actual peacekeeping is put at great peril. But also on the issue of abuse by peacekeepers. And, this is something that I've raised for years, really for decades. And we saw it really manifest in a very profound way in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and as well as in Haiti. I visited Goma in the DRC in 2008 to investigate, and I chaired 4 hearings, on that topic, just DR Congo. And in a word, what I saw when I was there, it was shocking. I met with the investigators from the UN. They were great. One of them was a Mountie from Canada who was frustrated by the lack of work that was being done to really ferret out these bad apples and bring them to justice, particularly in their home countries. And of course, the victims were severely traumatized, and that was clear from those that I met when I was there. Former Assistant Secretary General for the UN Peacekeeping Operations, Dr. Jane Hall-Lute, testified at one of those hearings in 2005, and she said, and I quote, "The blue helmet has become black and blue through self-inflicted wounds of some of our number, and we will not sit still until the luster of that blue helmet is restored. What we are doing to deal with the allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse," she said, "that has plagued peacekeeping missions in the past, and we understand from dialogue with member states that they plague deployments abroad for all of us. It's unacceptable," she went on. "It's simply unacceptable." And she tried, and Kofi Annan put out his zero-tolerance policy. And then I did a hearing many, many months later, and we heard from some of the same people trying to bring all of this to the fore, who said there's zero compliance with the zero tolerance. There was such a pushback, particularly from some of the sending countries. Peacekeepers must be protectors and never predators. The UN must do more to ensure that the perpetrators are punished and that these crimes are prevented in the first place. You know, failures of the UN system is not just in Africa. At a hearing I chaired in 1998, a guy named Hassan Nohanovic, who was the translator when the Dutch peacekeepers met with Mladic, and in that meeting, he came and he testified his entire family was butchered by Mladic. And he talked about how the 8,000 Muslims were killed in Srebrenica, and the Dutch peacekeepers shook hands, clanked glasses of champagne, and let them board buses rather than doing what they were deployed to do, and that was to protect. I went and was part of a reinternment in Srebrenica a few years later with Dr. Haris Salajic, who was then the president. And I tell you, I was moved to tears when some like 800 people who had been slaughtered, and it was 9,000 total, they were reinterned, and the families were there, and all of it could have been prevented, arguably, but I think they could have been prevented had the peacekeepers just been true, in this case the Dutch, to their work. We saw it with the Rwandan genocide, the famous Dallaire memo, and I held hearings on that, raised it continually. It wasn't the only one. It was bipartisan, our concern. But there was a case where an American president, and in this case Kofi Annan, because he was head of UN peacekeeping then, failed to see that this was about to happen, and much of that violence could have been mitigated had action been taken. Of the 11 UN peacekeeping operations currently active, 5 are in Africa, as we all know, including 3 in the missions in the Central African Republic, DRC, and South Sudan. And I visited the ones in South Sudan. Molly Fee was our ambassador then. And there are 71,000 troops deployed across 11 missions today. Since the UN began to record details in 2010, there have been 251 substantiated allegations of abuse or exploitation by uniformed personnel and 81 substantiated allegations by civilian personnel. And I'll put all the numbers into the record because they are very, very disturbing. And the UN, I think, wants to make it right, but you know they run into roadblocks. I'm going to go on for a few more minutes.
You don't have a few more minutes, Mr. Chairman. We have to.
Co-chaired meeting.
Yes, it is. We're going to keep to 5 minutes.
Are you serious? Okay. Let me say, just to finish it up, and I'll put all this into the record, but I go through in the record, or in this statement, how the UN has done a lot of good things. They really have. But they also, it comes down to implementation, which so often falls through, and I hope that we can change that. So your testimonies will be very helpful in that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you will have plenty of time to address your very important comments. But the Chair now recognizes the ranking member, Congresswoman Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild, with any statements you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. This is an opportunity to focus on our investments in peacekeeping operations and to make the case that these investments make us stronger. First and foremost, what we are talking about today is the need to stand up for fundamental rights and dignity in areas where they are under attack. But beyond the obvious humanitarian implications of that, these investments are also investments in global economic stability and our own national security. We have decades of evidence showing us how pivotal peacekeeping is to economic stability and development in conflict areas. And that, of course, creates a ripple effect throughout supply chains and the global economy at large. We know that UN peacekeeping operations over the years have revealed some profound flaws, most disturbingly, cases of sexual assault and other extremely serious forms of wrongdoing that have hurt the most vulnerable members of the very populations that peacekeepers were meant to protect. We've seen some significant progress on those challenges, but work remains to be done, and we always have to insist on the highest possible standard. This abuse should not happen anywhere, anytime. What is crystal clear to me is the way to address these issues is through more robust, more effective, more influential U.S. engagement in international fora, not by walking away from our commitments. Recently, I was encouraged by the administration's leadership supporting the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 2719, UNSCR, to allow UN-assessed contributions to fund the African Union peace support operations. We must continue building on this UN and African Union cooperation and strongly supporting the development of African Union capacity across the continent. With that, I look forward to a productive hearing. Again, I thank you both for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Of course, thank you. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today. The Honorable Michele Sison is the Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Mr. Jonathan Pratt is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of African Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Thank you for being here today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes out of respect for everyone present and to allow time for member questions. I now recognize Assistant Secretary Sison for her opening statement. And Madam, I assume I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Perfect, thank you.
Chairman James, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Jacobs, Ranking Member Wild, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss how the Bureau of International Organization Affairs is defending American interests and working with our multilateral partners to tackle the global challenges of conflict, insecurity, human rights violations, and more. It's good to be with you to discuss the future of peacekeeping in Africa. The U.S. is not only the largest financial contributor to UN peacekeeping, we are also the largest bilateral capacity-building partner to nearly 50 troop-contributing countries. But we recognize that UN peacekeeping operations face unprecedented challenges today, including faltering host nation cooperation and consent, and the presence of actors like the Wagner Group in conflict zones. So it's clear that we need to expand our multilateral toolkit for responding to security crises in Africa while simultaneously working to pushing to improve UN peacekeeping. The adoption last month of Security Council Resolution 2719 provides a framework for the partial funding of African-led peace support operations with UN-assessed contributions. We were very active in the negotiation of this resolution. We insisted that future African Union-led peace operations supported by UN-assessed contributions comply with UN human rights due diligence policy and are mandated to protect civilians and be authorized by and accountable to the UN Security Council. Mindful of our responsibility to be careful stewards of U.S. taxpayer dollars, we focused on burden sharing. We successfully put forward an amendment specifying that UN contributions to AU peace operations be capped at 75%. So we recognize the potential that future AU peace support operations offer to enhance peace and security in Africa. Given the knowledge that African stakeholders have of complex security challenges across the continent, AU-led peace operations may be better suited to tackle certain challenges. However, the lack of predictable and sustainable financing has hindered their ability in the past to implement their mandates. So we saw in Resolution 2719 an opportunity to memorialize the principles upon which this new mechanism should operate. As 2719 reinforces, these operations must be underpinned by mandates to protect civilians and must be linked to a political process to resolve the conflict. The complex crises across Africa demand new tools in addition to traditional UN peacekeeping operations. So we need tools that allow the international community to respond rapidly to threats against civilians, to prevent mass atrocities, counter violent extremists or terrorist groups, and stabilize a security situation to allow space for a political solution. African Union peace support operations may also serve as a counter to malign actors who seek to exploit security vacuums, an issue critically important to our U.S. national security. With 2719's adoption, we now have a complement to UN peacekeeping in situations in which traditional peacekeeping missions may not be the most effective tool. So in December, I joined the U.S. delegation to the UN Peacekeeping Ministerial in Accra, Ghana. The ministerial provided an opportunity to explore issues impacting UN peacekeeping, bringing in peacekeeping leaders from the field and African stakeholders. Earlier this month, I joined the National Defense University's Africa Center for Strategic Studies Force Commanders Roundtable, which benefited from the expertise of former UN and African Union mission leaders in examining the challenges of advancing Africa's peace and security architecture to meet these rising threats and to foster effective African-owned peacekeeping capacity. At both events, it became very clear that there are still a lot of questions to work through. Further consultations will be needed before consensus is reached on the first AU peace support operation to benefit from UN-assessed contributions. For the AU, its member states need to determine how to raise that remaining 25%. It's a key issue, and it will be subject to our discussions with the AU. Per Resolution 2719, that 25% may include AU contributions, in-kind contributions, and voluntary contributions from other nations. So we're encouraged that the AU has already established several important policies to align its peace support activities with relevant international human rights law and international humanitarian law considerations, as well as with the UN conduct and discipline frameworks. For the U.S. government, these discussions underscore the need for our internal clarity on the criteria for considering the deployment of AU peace support operations under 2719, such as the need for clear time-bound objectives. We'll continue to consult with you on these important issues. I look forward to your questions, but before closing, let me take this opportunity to underscore the importance of passing the National Security Supplemental Appropriations request as soon as possible.
Thank you,
so we
Madam
have the
Assistant Secretary,
resources.
but your time has expired. I would love to hear more about that when we get to the questions. The chairman now recognizes Mr. Pratt for his opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman James and Smith, Ranking Members Jacobs and Wild, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the future of peacekeeping and the increasing role of private military companies in Africa. The United States has played a role in supporting peace efforts in Africa for decades through our bilateral and multilateral diplomacy and by supporting humanitarian access and protection of vulnerable populations through peacekeeping. Those of us who have served in Africa are invested in peace efforts. Earlier in my own career, I was involved in diplomatic efforts to end the war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Later in my career in Sudan, I supported the implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and efforts to secure humanitarian access in Darfur. I have seen how the United States has made significant financial contributions to the United Nations, which has undertaken a number of complicated peacekeeping missions in Africa to provide help in tremendously challenging situations. These missions have helped safeguard civilian populations from armed groups and warring parties, despite shortcomings and specific instances of unacceptable conduct by some peacekeepers. As the security threats changed over time, peacekeeping missions have struggled to keep up. Today, we are seeing a desire from African leaders and the African Union to take the lead on peacekeeping efforts. It is in our strategic interest to support them. Assistant Secretary Sison outlined the significance of UN Security Council Resolution 2719 and how it responds to African leadership and advances in momentum from African partners with financial support from the United Nations to assume more responsibility for sustainable, effective, and accountable peacekeeping missions. We will continue to engage with Congress on how the United States supports and promotes this new tool. An essential element of UN, AU, and sub-regional missions is that they include safeguards designed to promote respect for human rights, protection of civilians, and humanitarian access. AU and sub-regional missions have demonstrated a capacity to mobilize quickly, especially when provided with adequately financed and reliable logistical support mechanisms. Over time, we're seeing a trend towards sub-regional and bilateral missions because of their ability to respond quickly, as well as address countries' national interest in combating instability in their neighborhood. It is important that missions adhere to their mandates and international law. The United States has made long-term investments in developing the capacity of African partners to deploy peace support operations, initially through the African Crisis Response Initiative, and then through the Africa Contingency Operations Training and Assistance Programs. Private contractors have played and continue to play an important role by providing logistical support, training, equipment, and other capacity building. With appropriate resources and oversight, Private contractors provide an efficient and effective means to enable troop and police contributing countries to deliver on the mandates asked of them. We have developed best practices for oversight and accountability mechanisms to ensure private contractors adhere to policy direction and comply with legal standards. In contrast, this is not what Russia's Wagner Group is or does. In the countries where Wagner is present, we have seen the number of terrorist attacks and attacks on civilians increase, accompanied by a decrease in humanitarian access, as well as an increase in reports of human rights abuses. Before closing, I want to take the opportunity to emphasize the vital importance of passing administration's National Security Supplemental Appropriations request as soon as possible. Let me also reiterate my appreciation to the subcommittees. We greatly value your support in upholding our shared commitments to help advance democracy, peace, and security as cornerstones for a successful U.S.-Africa partnership. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you and for convening this important hearing.
Mr. Pratt, I thank you for your service, for your dedication, and for your brevity. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. A year ago, the House unanimously passed a bill that requires the Department of State to take actions to stop China from being classified as a developing country by international organizations. And for those who are following these things, to get this particular Congress to agree on anything unanimous is an act of Congress itself. What, Assistant Secretary Sison, are the steps being taken to make sure that the United Nations changes the level of assessed contributions for China and ends its treatment as a developed country? And what is the U.S. doing to support burden sharing for peacekeeping costs among our allies and partners?
Thank you for that important question, Chairman. Listen, the U.S. has continually opposed the People's Republic of China's efforts to position itself as a developing country or as a champion for the developing world. We continue in our engagements, not just in New York, but in Geneva, Rome, elsewhere in the UN capitals, to increase awareness, particularly among the developing countries, that the PRC, China, does not negotiate in resolutions at the UN with their best interests at heart. The PRC is the #2 contributor of assessed contributions to the UN.
Yes, but what are we doing, ma'am?
What are we doing? We are there in New York in the budget committees. We are there in the UN Security Council in both the open and closed discussions as we push to make sure that others realize that China's self-identification as a developing country, paying less than it really should, is hurting other nations' best interests.
Cool. Are you seeing any results?
I believe that we have in the Budget Committee, the 5th Committee of the UN, and then there's another oversight committee up in New York, increased awareness. There's a new reporting requirement, sir, on China's developing nation status, so you on the Hill are going to be seeing on a regular basis. This is due to you middle of this year in the NDAA state authorization. This reporting requirement is a new one. You'll be getting the first report shortly.
Sweet, thank you. Mr. Pratt, now countries in Africa that have contracted with Wagner and now its successor frequently state that in the face of existential security threats and failed or absent alternatives being offered from the West, Wagner is the only choice available to them to secure their security. Do you agree that this is the reason that CAR, Mali, and others have turned to Wagner?
Let me say first, these are extremely difficult operating environments, as you well know. Part of the question revolves around our own restrictions in terms of 7008 restrictions on what we are able to do in those countries. I believe that UN missions have been successful in addressing some of the concerns of those countries, but not all of them. And I think there are other resources that those countries could draw on to solve those problems that would be much better than a Russian solution.
So do you agree or disagree that this is a reason? Is it a reason or is it an excuse in your experience in those 3 particular countries?
I think it's a really complicated question, and it's hard to address the security issues in those locations.
All right, I actually think that it gives an out for people to skirt what we believe are the very basic standards of democracy, good governance, and human rights. I believe that other organizations are able to skirt that, and the leaders of these states are taking advantage of being able to run around international law and the rules-based order. We must make sure that we stand by our allies and stand by human rights, democracy, and good governance, but the American people are beginning to question what we are getting in return for our great generosity. We need to, the difference between investments and charity, the line is accountability, transparency, and results. And the American people are not seeing the results. And so hopefully in the minutes that we have in here, you can give us better answers than maybe, and it's complicated. We know it's complicated, but you're here to help us find answers so we can support the overall mission. I'm going to wrap up my statements, and I'm going to recognize Ranking Member Sarah Jacobs from California.
Thank you, Chairman James. You know, I want to actually follow on your questions about, you know, China's influence and what they've been doing in the UN system. Last year, I reintroduced my bill, the United States Commitment to Peacekeeping Act, that would repeal our 25% cap on U.S. contributions and allow the U.S. to pay its full dues. It also encourages the U.S. mission to redouble its efforts to make progress on a range of peacekeeping reform initiatives. Assistant Secretary Sison, do you think this proposal would be useful for advocating for U.S. priorities at the UN? And if so, why?
It's a very important question, Congresswoman. Listen, this issue has allowed the People's Republic of China, PRC, an easy talking point, you know, recognizing current budget constraints. We are committed to working with Congress to pay our bills to the UN in time and in full, you know, to pay the UN peacekeeping arrears as well. It's really important that we take these steps to meet our financial obligations, particularly when our strategic competitors, but PRC, China is at the top of the list here, use this against us, not only in open sessions of the Budget Committee, but believe me, behind our backs when they are talking to and with developing countries. So our job is to lead at the UN. Our job is to push the UN to be better through reforms. To make the UN better, we've got to not only be there at the table, we've got to have that credibility. So we need to push back against the PRC. We need to pay our bills in full and on time.
Thank you. And I was wondering if both of you could talk about what lessons the AU PSOs should learn from UN peacekeeping operations, given the many challenges that peacekeeping missions have faced that hinder their performance, like budget constraints, challenging political environments, lack of a coherent political strategy. How do you plan to engage with the AU on structuring their missions in a way that mitigates these challenges? And what safeguards are in place to make sure that UN funds to AU peace support operations are not used to commit human rights abuses or contribute to civilian harm?
Thanks for the question, Representative. We'd like to see a scenario using this new tool where we can shape missions in a way that is clearly defined, time-bound, and does have the controls in place to address the concerns that you outlined. And we also want to see them supported by a political process so that there's a clear outcome to what the mission is trying to achieve. I think that would ensure that we are seeing good value for money for the U.S. taxpayer.
Look, both of us were really looking forward to this hearing today to be able to hear from you directly. I think it's also going to be very important as we have our high-level and very robust U.S. delegation going out to Addis for the AU African Union Summit, February 17 through 19, that we do continue this conversation with you and your teams, continue our own internal interagency conversation on outlining those criteria for what would make the most sense to set up for success this first use of UN-assessed funding for AU peace operations. It's an opportunity for us to partner with African leaderships. It's a partnership, of course, with civil society and the people of Africa. But we need to hear from the AU also in Addis, February 17 and 19. What are their priorities? And also, what is their plan also for coming up with their portion, that 25%? Again, this in-kind contributions, voluntary contributions from third countries, and the AU's own contributions. The resolution was just passed in December. We're in January now. This conversation with you is an important milestone, as is the AU Summit. Thank you.
Thank you. And with our remaining few seconds, can you just discuss the human rights standards that are in place and how the U.S. and the UN will work with the AU to ensure that those standards are adhered to in any missions, and what safeguards are in place to protect if they don't?
So this discussion of the use of UNSS funding for AU peace operations took years. The 2007, 2015, 2016, what we were needing from the AU was the commitment on adopting the UN's human rights due diligence policy, other international human rights frameworks, the conduct and discipline frameworks, also the financial management frameworks. That is what took so long, along with this burden sharing agreement. It is clear that these AU peace support operations that go out with any UNSS funding, of course, under the accountability of the UN Security Council, but they have to have that human rights aspect. They have to be there first and foremost to protect civilians as they are taking on these important tasks in the field. But the human rights piece, protection of civilians piece is front and center.
Thank you for your priorities on protecting civilians and respecting human rights, and there's nobody in this Congress who's done more to protect human rights than my friend Chris Smith. Mr. Smith, recognized for 5 minutes for your question, sir.
Let me just ask you, Madam Secretary, especially with regards to the 8 South Africans who were forcibly repatriated, and they're awaiting, I know, an investigation for abuse of people inside of DR Congo. Are there others that you know of? Do you have a realistic expectation that South Africa will do a credible job of investigating, and then, most importantly, after that, prosecuting and jailing if they are guilty? Secondly, is the African Union and the African countries really focused on and seriously committed to ensuring that sexual abuse as well as trafficking is at the core of what they do? Yes, peacekeeping is extremely important, but they better make sure that the peacekeepers aren't part of the exploitation group that they're there to defend against. So if you could speak to that, and will you be raising that when you meet again with them in your upcoming meeting? And finally, the issue of arrears, which is always a troubling issue. I mean, we provide money, but we also do a lot of things like airlift and other things that don't find themselves on the ledger when you talk about arrearage, and we don't get credit for it. We get credit with a good thank you and all that, but no credit in terms, unless that's changed recently, for what we provide. Is there any attempt to try to get that a formula where that would be included in our total cost commitment that we undertake for peacekeeping?
Thank you for raising these important issues, Chairman. On the DRC specific question on sexual exploitation and abuse, the investigation continues. I am sorry to say that I have had to raise question of additional allegations against additional members of the peacekeeping force out there, MONUSCO in DRC, in both December and January meetings with UN peacekeeping leadership. We are pushing on this. It is completely unacceptable that those who are sent to protect civilians, protect vulnerable populations, abuse the civilian populations. Completely unacceptable. As you know, sir, we have a regular stream of reporting that comes to this committee, to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on UN peacekeeping, sexual exploitation and abuse, and trafficking in persons. The two are covered in the same report. We see the numbers going up. We can argue that may be due to more reporting and the UN's own training of its people to report, but what I will say is that we are on this. We need to keep pushing the UN to be better. We are leading. We are pushing. The allegations that we see reported are against military, they are against police, and they are against civilian staff assigned to UN peacekeeping missions. We will continue to work closely with mission leadership. We're going to call this out. And we are supporting the UN's Special Coordinator on Sexual Exploitation and Abuse and the Victims' Rights Office, very importantly. And we will push on these repatriations. As you know, sir, the problem is when a unit or an individual is repatriated, the prosecutions are done in the host country. More than 100 countries have signed on to sort of a code of conduct, but everybody needs to sign on to this. On your very good point on can we count airlift, logistics, training, and so forth, I'm taking that back to our peacekeeping teams, our Bureau of Political Military Affairs that does the great G-Point peacekeeping training, our INL Bureau does the great police training, and take on that great idea. Thank you.
And if you could emphasize with your African interlocutors how important it is on a bipartisan way, bicameral way, that these issues be addressed very robustly. You know, I often find that there's lip service by some, and I'm not saying they're paying lip service to it, but, and then when it gets down to, is it really serious? Are you really committed? Do you care for that 13-year-old who's about to get raped and abused? Well, we have to, and we do, and I know you do, so please do everything you can to let them know how important we think it is in the U.S. Congress. And I would say that's the executive branch view as well, but they need to know that we care about that very, very seriously. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And on that question of does the AU understand this, that is why this took so long, getting the AU to sign on to its own framework on the conduct and discipline. This sexual exploitation and abuse, trafficking of persons is part of that. Thank you.
If I could
Well,
just-
they're going to need to put their money where their mouth is. The chair now recognizes Ms. Wild.
Thank you very much. I want to question. I have questions for both of you, so I'm going to kind of combine it all and then let you answer. I mentioned in my opening remarks UN Security Council Resolution 2719 and the importance of expanding UN-AU cooperation. Assistant Secretary Sison, I'd like you to speak to the significance of the resolution and its implementation. Ambassador Pratt, can you speak to the importance of supporting the strengthening of AU-led peace support mission capacity across the continent? And either or both of you, can you touch on why a robust U.S. commitment to peacekeeping is critical, specifically for countering malign Russian influence in conflict areas? Thank you.
So on this new resolution, 2719, and again, it's great to be here today to get your input directly. You know, African countries were demanding new tools. We worked with the AU to come up with this framework. It is a framework. Now we've got to go to implementation. But we agree that what we were seeing in the field was beyond what traditional UN peacekeeping was set up to do, the violent extremism, the non-state actors, the use of IEDs, the disinformation. So these African Union peace support operations that now will be partially funded once authorized by the UN Security Council, they reflect the need for African leadership. You know, it's clear that UN peacekeeping didn't have all of the answers. We will be looking, as Jonathan had also mentioned, at where does this make sense? Where can the troops deploy rapidly? This is what we've seen, the value added of the AU's own peace support operations and the regional operations, the regional economic REX operations. Over the last 30 years, we've seen about 38 of these regional operations. They're often able to deploy very quickly, but they didn't have that predictable financial capability. They didn't have that sustained financing. So they fell down after a quick launch. They weren't able to meet their mandates, or the logistics piece didn't fully support the mandate. So that's where we're going to have to focus. On
I'm going to
Wagner.
stop you there for a second because I want to give Ambassador Pratt an opportunity here, if you could, sir.
I think that's exactly right what the Assistant Secretary is saying. We want to be able to work with sub-regional organizations to be more nimble if they have an AU mandate, and I think they'll be able to respond more quickly. Historically, as I said in my statement, we've been able to support African countries in training and equipping themselves and ensuring that they've got safeguards in terms of their behavior and conduct in these locations. Part of the hearing is also focused on how we use companies to fulfill some of the logistical and training roles, and we've done that successfully in several locations.
And could both of you just comment briefly on the importance of this commitment for countering malign Russian influence?
So when we saw the host country consent disappear in Mali for the UN peacekeeping mission, and I traveled out to Mali a couple of years ago myself to look at how that operation was going. I fear the worst for the civilian population of Mali. I do not believe that the transitional government had that interest at heart when they brought in Wagner and pushed out the peacekeeping mission. But now we've got this new tool to look at where we can deploy African peacekeepers with this new use of UN-assessed funding for the AU peace support operations. I believe that the African neighbors, the African partners are heavily invested. In fact, they've been heavily invested all along. When you look at the deployment of African peacekeepers at the UN peacekeeping operations, the number of fatalities, for example, last year, 56 of the 66 were actually in these African peacekeeping missions. So the 25% burden sharing is there, but putting their men and women on the front lines in these operations is also extremely significant, and we are partnering with them to lift up these priorities in their own regions.
Okay, with that, my time has expired. I'm sorry, Ambassador Pratt. I yield back.
Thank you, ma'am, and we will have time for a second round. It's very good questions. Thank you. I now recognize Chairwoman Kim for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, I want to thank the witnesses for joining us today. The UN Security Council Resolution 2719 allows for consideration of UN financing of AU-led peacekeeping missions. This provides a framework to a needed security alternative to the current options, but the resolution left out a lot of important details unanswered, most pertinently around the role of the African Union. This resolution includes a burden-sharing aspect with UN funding being capped at 75%. This is an amendment I understand the United States led. However, I'm concerned that leaving the question of where the additional 25% of funding will come from to a case-by-case basis will hamper the ability of this framework to be efficiently deployed. The African Union has well-documented financial and logistical challenges. The AU Peace Fund has not yet reached its $400 million fundraising goal, and the absence of any major AU-led peace operations to address the conflicts in Ethiopia and Sudan illustrates the AU's limited intervention capability. So, Assistant Secretary Sison, where do you expect this additional 25% of funding to come from? And what have you heard from African partner countries on this requirement?
Now, it's an important question, and that burden sharing, as I said, was a key piece of this negotiation in December up in New York. But again, this 25% is the AU contribution. It is in-kind contributions, and we expect the UN member states and the AU member states to go out to other countries, to others, and look for voluntary contributions. And I think that should not be underestimated. The United States is not the only country in the world that really is very concerned about these complex crises, the violent extremist organizations, the terrorists operating in a number of locations in Africa. So I do believe that other countries are going to come up and support.
So are you concerned that this unaccounted for 25% of funding will prove problematic in seeing this framework be utilized efficiently?
I think the determination of the African member states, and we saw this in the lead up to the negotiations and the ultimate adoption, they really wanted this. They really wanted this partnership. These crises are in their own backyards. They are serious about this. We are sending, as I said, a senior delegation to the Africa Union Summit in February, in 2 weeks' time, to speak to this issue more in more detail. The case-by-case nature of the determination of the budget is intentional, because we want to make sure that we don't have a cookie-cutter approach. The in-kind contribution for one mission may differ from one setting to another. I hope that helps answer the question, Congresswoman.
Are you confident in the African Union's ability to complete its goal and fully operationalize the AU Peace Fund and AU Standby Force?
So this is an opportunity. It is an opportunity for the UN and the AU to partner. We believe that this is an appropriate additional tool for our toolbox on peace and security in Africa. And we'll be pushing to make good use and set this up for success. It's important.
Thank you. The AU mission in Somalia, that transition to the AU transition mission in Somalia has been an experiment of some sort of a AU-led mission authorized by the UN Security Council. And the mission's mandate is to help stabilize Somalia and protect the nascent Somali government. Pratt, has ATMIS had success in stabilizing Somalia? And what lessons can be drawn from this unique mission framework in terms of successful cooperation and mission fulfillment, as well as those lessons of the possible improvement?
Thank you for the question. ATMIS has played a positive role, but it has also had drawbacks. And we are trying to replace it with something that will be more clearly defined, more limited in scope, and with more specific outcomes so that it can be a successful mission. The government of Somalia is supportive of this approach, and so I think we'll have a tool going forward that will be more responsive to the security environment. As you know, there are several factors in the security environment there. ATMIS is just one piece of it. There are also bilateral pieces of it from several countries, and we're one of them.
Thank you. I see my time's up.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I now recognize Congresswoman Shifless McCormick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When civil war broke out in South Sudan in 2013, UN peacekeepers played a crucial role in protecting civilians, opening their bases across the country to more than 200,000 civilians who were fleeing interethnic and political violence. In recent years, South Sudan has made a halting progress towards implementing a peace agreement between the warring parties, but serious political challenges and persistent violence remains. The U.S. has been putting pressure on leadership of the country to hold elections and implement the peace agreement. As the country prepares for that, UN officials have expressed concern that South Sudan is not yet in a position to hold free, fair, credible, and peaceful elections. UN reports to date suggest that there has been insufficient progress in implementing transitional security arrangements. For what I'm reading, the president of South Sudan is very determined to hold these historic elections. UNMISS has assessed that several conditions must be in place by April 2024 to hold elections by December. If those conditions are not met, it is unclear how the mission will proceed. Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Pratt, if UNMISS assesses the elections are not feasible, would you recommend to the government to postpone the elections again?
I agree with you. Conditions have to be in place for the election, and we would be very concerned with a scenario where support and funding goes into a mission when they're not ready for that election. And so we need to see the conditions in place for that election to occur.
If they insist, how can the U.S. assist them?
I think there are a lot of tools that are at our disposal, especially diplomatic pressure and political pressure from all of the partners. It's been an extremely challenging scenario that you described in order to get them to those outcomes, but I think we have to have teeth behind the tools that we're deploying to get them to move to prepare properly.
UNMISS's mandate is up for renewal in the UN Security Council in March. As discussions around the mandate renewal continues, how is the U.S. working to ensure that UNMISS has tools, resources, and authorities necessary to mitigate the risk of violence before, during, and after these potential elections?
So we work very closely with these UN peacekeeping missions on the ground. In fact, in December, the IO team from my own office was out in the field with UNMISS on a monitoring and evaluation mission. I also met with the head of the mission in December, Fink Haysom. Look, as you probably have all heard, the Special Representative Haysom briefed the Security Council in December on this very question on the elections. And he was really clear. He said the conditions did not exist at that time for credible or peaceful elections, and our own U.S. response was very clear. Assessed contributions shouldn't be used by the UN peacekeeping mission to support an electoral process that, absent urgent action by the transition government, wouldn't be free, fair, and credible. So we do expect additional briefings by Special Representative Haysom to the Council, and the conversations with him long distance from the field will also continue to make an assessment on the levels of support for UNMISS's, if there is any, on the election support. Of course, the big key here is the protection of civilians through this UNMISS mandate, and that is front and center on everything that we do with UNMISS to be able to support in this large territory the protection of civilians.
Well, I want to ask you another question. The humanitarian situation in South Sudan is dire. 2/3 of the population is food insecure, and more than 9 million people depend on international assistance to survive. Assistant Secretary, can you discuss the continued importance of having the UN peacekeepers in South Sudan, particularly considering the difficult security and humanitarian situation?
Sure. This conflict in Sudan has, of course, affected the UNMISS South Sudan peacekeeping mission operations. An influx of over 450,000 people crossing the border into South Sudan. This is in addition to the 2.3 million internally displaced persons in South Sudan. And again, another 9.4 million in South Sudan who need humanitarian assistance. Very, very vulnerable populations. They also need protection services. So UNMISS is really critical to providing the support to these vulnerable populations, protection to the people of South Sudan among the already very stretched capacities of the humanitarian agencies, World Food Program, and so forth, and really allowing that humanitarian access for the delivery of basic services, particularly in the northern states.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Chairman Kane for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this extraordinarily important hearing. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here with us today. And a recent hardship to peacekeeping missions has been eroding host country consent. How can the U.S. government and international bodies and partners better recognize the signs and respond to concerns before relationships erode to the point of mission conclusion and drawdown?
It is a really important question, and I'll tell you, at that African peacekeeping ministerial at the National Defense University Force Commanders Roundtable, this was probably the #1 topic of conversation. We expect the heads of peacekeeping missions and the entire UN country team in these countries to have a continuing conversation, a back and forth with the host government. So earlier monitoring and detection of when things start to become difficult in this regard, not just host country consent, but also cooperation, because we are also seeing in some of these peacekeeping missions, the host government is saying, sure, the peacekeepers can be here, and yet they are not providing, nighttime landing clearances for aircraft or allowing contractors to come in with visas in a timely manner to support the peacekeeping mission. So there were other ways to nibble away at the effective delivery of these important mandates of these peacekeeping missions. I think the message to UN leadership is to make sure that we, the member states, we the U.S., because we are footing in large part the bills for these peacekeeping missions, but also we have, a moral responsibility on this protection of civilian peace. Earlier news to us when things look like they're going south, so we can also go in there and engage on these questions. But this also goes back to look at what these strategic competitors are doing. And here we're going back to the Wagner question. Clearly, some of these countries are not interested in protecting civilians. Some of these countries are more interested in corrupt mining deals or other reasons to have Wagner and similar non-state actors in there.
Thank you. Mr. Pratt, what other factors would you add to that in Mali or Somalia or the DRC are contributing to the erosion of host country support for peacekeeping missions?
I'll start with the DRC, who's more familiar with that situation. I think there are regional political concerns and tensions between especially Rwanda and Congo. And I think, unfortunately, the UN mission there has been politicized to some degree, but I'm confident that both sides continue to see value in the mission and playing specific roles that can be defined in terms of verification, monitoring, and implementation of a peace agreement. So I think as they see value in the mission, there will be continued consent. There is an ongoing discussion, as you know, on the MONUSCO mission on a responsible drawdown, and we're encouraging that very much to make sure that we're not losing tools that could be very valuable. The situation in Mali is much more complicated because the government essentially lost confidence in their ability to carry out the mission against very challenged counterterrorism environment. And so that was an unfortunate decision because that mission, as you know, was implementing a broader peace agreement with the Algiers Accord. So it's an unfortunate loss, frankly.
Okay. And so what specific tools are you using to make sure you are actually recouping some of the assets that are there?
We've worked directly with United Nations, and I defer as well to the Assistant Secretary to address the question, but we've pushed them directly to ensure that they're removing all of the equipment that they possibly can, that it's feasible and cost-effective financially to be able to do that. Yeah.
My time is run out. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize Congressman Jackson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman James. Thank you, Assistant Secretary. Thank you for your attendance today. How does Congress's failure to appropriate sufficient funding to pay our peacekeeping dues in full and address our obligations to the United Nations in the arrear affect our peacekeeping ability in Africa?
It is a really important question. And again, we really do lead in New York and in the other UN capitals. And in leading, and as we push the UN to do better, and as we push the UN to reform, if we haven't paid what we owe in full and on time, our credibility is undercut. And particularly, People's Republic of China will not hesitate to call us out, whether it's in a budget meeting or in their conversations where we are not present. It is in our national interest, to be fully engaged in supporting UN peacekeeping. I believe terrorism has no boundaries. The African partners are asking for our help, not only in the traditional UN peacekeeping, but also with this new use of UN-assessed funding for the AU peace support operations. And of course, promoting peace and stability in Africa really does lift up shared prosperity. We're supporting a more stable, more free society in these countries where we are. So all of these arguments point to the fact that we do need to pay our bills in full and on time, and that includes the arrears as well, sir.
Thank you. Can you point to any disinformation campaigns that are currently going on the continent that we should be apprised of?
Let's start.
There are a number of very pernicious campaigns going on. I mean, one was that had to do with, for example, in Mali, the effectiveness of that mission there, the UN mission. And I think a lot of the information campaign that the Russians were pushing around this is one of the factors that drove the government to ask for the mission's withdrawal. The Russians have also put out all sorts of information, false information about widely recognized positive campaigns on health programs, for example. And so I think we've seen a scenario where publics are being misinformed about good, solid programs that are in their interests.
If I can jump in on this, it
Yes,
is
please.
really important because this misinformation, this disinformation erodes the local population's trust in the peacekeepers there sent to protect them. So we saw these fake letters circulating in Mali and the Central African Republic. We saw these social media campaigns in the DRC against the peacekeepers. This isn't just in Africa. In Lebanon, UNIFIL, government of Lebanon, heard from us because there was false assertions that UNIFIL, the peacekeeping mission out there in Lebanon, didn't have a mandate to patrol independently. One thing that we are doing in the IO Bureau, we have sent a young junior professional officer position funded by Congress to the Department of Global Communications to work on this disinformation front and center. We've also included the mandate and the budgeting for countering disinformation in a number of these peacekeeping mission resolutions and taken it to the Budget Committee so that these are funded. Really dangerous when you were putting peacekeepers and civilians at risk with this fake letters, fake social media postings, and so forth.
Last question. Is this creating a more hostility between the African government and the UN peacekeeping troops?
Well, I think we've seen the example of a very unfortunate example of Mali, where they lost a tool that could have been very valuable and was playing a positive role. And so yes, that's an example, a very tangible one of where we lost an important mission. I think in the Congo, I would hope we'll see a scenario where the MONUSCO mission continues to play a valuable role, and we may see turning the corner on the ability of that mission to continue to operate there effectively.
Thank you for your time. I yield back, Chairman James.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. I now recognize Congressman McCormick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I was going to go a totally different line of questioning, but you brought up an interesting point about paying our dues and about our participation in the United Nations. My first interaction with the United Nations was in 1994 in Operation Restore Hope. As you may remember, famously we withdrew from Rwanda and because some UN peacekeeping troops were killed, and about 1 million people were killed shortly thereafter. Not a very good peacekeeping mission. And that was my first taste of the United Nations. Since that time, I'm sure you're aware of the accusations of thousands of child trafficking accusations against the United Nations troops. Of sex for food and other problems, theft, murder, embezzlement, including people who are in the hierarchy of the United Nations themselves, with very little accountability, I might add. You talked about how important it is to pay our dues. 28% of the United Nations is what we pay, and I think that's around $13 billion per year right now. Probably averaged around $10 billion since 1994 when I was there, which means around $300 billion that we paid to the United Nations. Now, what we've gotten out of that in Africa and other places is a continued decline of United States representation in the United Nations as China continues to supplant us throughout Africa. When these countries are voting against us actively, that they're taking China's side constantly in United Nations votes. as well as their demeanor, as well as their support for people who are not only anti-U.S., but also anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, going against our own strategic views worldwide. I'm not really sure why we have to make sure that the United States is paying our dues when the United Nations continues to be increasingly anti-U.S. interest. And what upsets me is when you look at the development of China and their influence, and we already had Russian influence in Africa. I would say that both Russia and China are more influential in Africa than we are already. And certainly with that deterioration in the United Nations influence, where you have also, I believe, over 10,000 Chinese firms now operating throughout the continent. Of the 54 countries in Africa, 5 having diplomatic relationships with another ally or strategic interest partner, Taiwan. 25 countries backed China over the Hong Kong national security law in 2020. In 2019, countries in Africa constituted about half of the 37 nations on a letter defending China and the Uyghur genocide. Clearly, we're losing our influence on the world stage, and not only are we losing our influence, but we're funding it to the tune of 28% and $13 billion per year. So I wanted you to defend your statement when you say it's important to pay our dues to an organization that I'm seeing becoming more increasingly contrary to our strategic goals.
Thank you for your question, Congressman. So it is easy to point to the peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping operations that have faced severe challenges. Mali, we've been talking a lot about the withdrawal of MINUSMA. There are success stories. Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone, not too far away from Mali, where we saw peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping go in and stability result. We just had Sierra Leone join the UN Security Council January 1. We just had an inauguration in Liberia. Since the end of the Cold War, sir, the UN has attempted to end 16 civil wars by deploying peacekeeping operations. Of those 16, 11 successes, none of those 11 countries returned to civil war. Even when a mission has faced severe challenges, peacekeepers have succeeded in protecting civilian lives. We have the Government Accountability Office, our own GAO, several studies, 2 a decade apart, 2007 and 2018, showing that UN peacekeeping operations are far less expensive than if the U.S. sent in our own boots on the ground. And of course, we share those costs in UN peacekeeping missions with other member states. So the most recent 2018 GAO.
I'm sorry, we're about to run out of time, and actually making good points, and I'll give you credit for that. But what I will say is that if we're going to do our fair part in funding the United Nations, they have to be far more accountable to our interests, not just in peacekeeping, but in everything they do. And I mean everything they do, because we've also seen them support people who actually actively participate in war against our allies, including Hamas, which just came up. So I just want to make the point that just because you do some good doesn't mean you necessarily align with our strategic outlook. And if we're going to bear the burden of the vast preponderance of funding this organization, it needs to come more in line with what we're trying to achieve. And with that, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick, for your very important, salient questions. I now recognize Congressman Baird for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate our witnesses being here. You know, the United States, kind of to what my colleague just talked about, is the largest contributor to the UN peacekeeping. And in fiscal year 22, $1.3 billion was contributed to the 4 largest missions, all of which were in Africa. So Assistant Secretary Sison, do you feel that the investment into these peacekeeping missions is a responsible use of taxpayer funds when the missions fail to restore peace and order, which is kind of like what my colleague just asked?
So here's the thing, sir, and this is a critically important question. And it gets to the importance not just of conflict response, but conflict prevention. So I need to say up front that part of what we do, of course, is not just support and work with the UN's peacekeeping missions, but we also work with that part of the UN that works on conflict prevention, peace building, because of course, peacekeeping is one tool in addressing peace and security, but we need preventative diplomacy, building inclusive political dialogue, insisting on transparency and anti-corruption and good governance, mobilizing a wide range of civil society partners to, really get at these causes of instability in fragile states that leave these vacuums for these bad actors, these malign actors to come in. So peacekeeping, but also conflict prevention. And again, we take very seriously oversight and accountability of the peacekeeping monies that go to the United Nations, of our contributions to the Peace Building Fund, which we also support. We send out, as I said, our own teams from my own office to each and every of the peacekeeping missions, not only in Africa for these monitoring and evaluation teams, but those around the world, Lebanon, Cyprus, and so forth, and to what we call the special political missions of the United Nations, because there are also places where the UN mediation, peace building, political dialogue experts are posted to try to do this important conflict prevention work. So yes, sir, I do think this is an investment that is worthy of U.S. Attention, U.S. taxpayer dollars. And again, it is in our national security. We have seen that bad actors thousands of miles away, terrorists, extremists, have an impact not only on their own region, but on the stability and security of our friends and partners and on our own people here at home. And again, these African countries, to go back to the use of UNSS funding for AU peace operations, they are asking for our help. They are asking for our help. And I think that is an important partnership aspect we need to consider, sir.
Could I ask, do these actions help us counteract what the Chinese Communist Party is doing in some of these countries?
So when we see the Chinese come in, it is often based on a deal, road construction, mining, a specific commercial deal. It is true that China has come in bigger to the UN in terms of what they are contributing, both monetarily and I will point out also peacekeeping personnel. We want to lift up why we're here. We're here to protect civilians. We're here with peacekeeping to keep these humanitarian access corridors open for badly needed food, medicine, and so forth. We are not interested in sending peacekeeping missions out to look for the mining deal. So I think as we point out what our intentions are and what those are of some of our strategic competitors, our developing country partners do see a difference.
Mr. Pratt, do you have any consideration or any thought? You got about 13 seconds to answer your question.
Agree with what the Assistant Secretary said. I would just say that to the extent that UN, AU, or sub-regional missions uphold the rule of law and create a framework for governance, I think that counters corrupt activity or corrupt deal-making and potentially shines a light on it.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Congressman Mills for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start out by just saying that I've worked in both NATO and UN peacekeeping operations, whether it was in Kosovo or whether it was in other areas when I was in uniform. And I also recall a lot of issues. The UN, we can point to a tremendous amount of things where there's been longstanding concerns with UN peacekeeping personnel engaging in sexual exploitations, other types of abuse that's gone on. We found out that the 10 to 15% of all UNRWA employees, 13,000 of which are in Lebanon, are either supportive or have, in fact, been a part of Hezbollah. We found that 12 UNRWA employees actually took place in the October 7 attacks, and over 3,000 UNRWA teachers are on record and on video celebrating the attacks and the actual horrific incidents that took place. You also have radicalized curriculum that was part of the funding under the $343 million that America put forth. You have the United Nations Security Council, who, whether it be under General Secretary Ban Ki-moon or even Gutierrez, wouldn't even look at Resolution 2231 JCPOA violations when we had caught 2 different ships transporting mid-range ballistic missiles in direct violations of the actual UN resolutions. I've started looking at it and referring to it not as the United Nations, but as useless nations. We're not doing our jobs. We haven't redefined exactly what it is that justifies the continuation of funding by American taxpayers when we have seen a immediate expansion of what China's been able to do. This hasn't prevented China from the propaganda, misinformation campaigns to sow doubt by developing nations where they're now moving away from the U.S. dollar as a global currency. We haven't seen where this has in any way slowed down the Belt and Road Initiative. And in fact, the only thing that slowed down Belt and Road Initiative is China's own economy is suffering so badly that they couldn't continue to actually fund it. And they had more strikes last year in their workforce than they've ever seen throughout China's history. I mean, I'm having a difficult understanding of even justifying why we're a part of UN at all. And when these continue to be more and more of these issues that come back, we can continue to use the excuse, oh, well, we're not defined by, a couple of the employees. We're not defined by a couple of bad apples. I don't think it's a couple of bad apples. I think it's rotten to the core. And I think that there's an entire evaluation that needs to be looked at. So my question, first to start, Assistant Secretary Sison, you've done considerable work throughout your career to counter trafficking in persons. Considering the prominence of U.S. funds in these peacekeeping operations, is it your assessment that the sexual exploitation and abuse proliferated by UN peacekeeping personnel reflect poorly on the image and reputation of the United States?
Thank you for that specific question on sexual exploitation and abuse in peacekeeping. And I do want to say that we, of course, watch like a hawk for any allegations in any other part of UN operations, including in humanitarian delivery, because it occurs there as well. But since we're here, to talk primarily about peacekeeping, we are leading on this. I believe that most member states and those who are watching this space see us pushing, calling for accountability, calling for the transparent reporting, calling for the repatriation of those who perpetrators. On a larger scale, sir, we do have an interest, I do believe, to my core, in making the UN better and working through the UN to deliver to these vulnerable populations. But we need to lead. We need to be at the table.
I apologize for interrupting. That's great that you're willing to look at reforms, but this isn't something that's just occurred. Throughout your career, these types of incidents have continued to take place overseas. These types of sexual exploitations, abuses, funding of terrorist organizations. We now know that the billions of dollars that went in to Gaza, many of which that cash was used for the terror tunnels that was there to launch the attacks. I mean, we're funding our own terroristic attacks, and we're saying we're there for human rights reasoning, but then allowing our own employees to be able to violate the human rights of those who are most vulnerable. I don't know that this is just simply a reform reevaluation. I think this is a whether or not the UN even stands for what it used to originally stand for, and whether or not we even need to be a part of it. And I'm siding on the side of us not being. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. I would agree that allowing human rights violations and anti-Semitism rankling the UN is not leadership, is the exact opposite. I now recognize Congresswoman Kalmangar-Dove for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I guess just for the record, I support Taylor Swift. So, okay now. On a continent that is facing civil wars, insurgencies, and terrorism, peacekeeping missions provide life-saving security that many host governments are not able to sustain themselves. And despite funding constraints and tough operating environments, peacekeeping missions have historically succeeded in saving civilian lives, improving humanitarian access, and expanding state authority in rebel-held territory. They do this with multilateral authorization and funding at 1/8 the cost to American taxpayers of a comparable U.S. force. And frankly, without peacekeeping or tools like AU-led peace support operations, we are often left with only bad alternatives, kind of like being here in Congress. The United States would have to unilaterally shoulder the responsibility for funding and deploying American troops to conflict zones in Africa, and many of us can't even name all of the countries on the continent, or we would pave the way for malign actors such as the Wagner Group to become the security partner of choice for many African nations. A bad alternative. Talk about a bad apple. So we have already seen this happen following the withdrawal of the mission in Mali, in part due to the Wagner Group. We have seen violence and conflict get worse. Understanding that the world benefits when there is peace and security and diplomacy on the African continent, we all have an interest in making peacekeeping missions as effective as possible. So questions. Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Pratt, when people think about conflict on the African continent, they don't immediately associate it with important strides towards peace and security. So can you speak to the evidence of peacekeeping missions' successes on the continent of Africa?
Yes, where there's a specific defined mission, especially one that's time-bound, we've seen successes, including in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and a number of other locations. I still believe that the mission in the Congo, and the MONUSCO mission, has the potential to deliver on a peace agreement between the parties that are on the edge of conflict in eastern Congo. I served earlier in my career in Sudan and negotiated for humanitarian access for the UNMISS mission in Darfur at the time, and that had a very specific concrete benefit to the population, including protection on human rights grounds, but also delivery of life-saving services that you described. So just despite other challenges that those missions faced, there were definitely successes that we pushed very hard to achieve.
Thank you. And after Mali's military government gained power in a coup, it demanded the withdrawal of the MINUSMA peacekeeping mission in 2023 and started closely collaborating with the Wagner Group. So, Assistant Secretary Sison, what has been the impact of MINUSMA's withdrawal on the security situation in Mali and the status of the 2015 peace accord? And has this empowered regional al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates and the Wagner Group?
Really important question. As the peacekeeping mission formally drew down December 31, again, not a decision by the transitional government that was in the best interests of the Malian people. They just a couple of days ago, in fact, renounced or withdrew from what they call the Algiers Accord. So that's the political process. This is not going in the right direction. I met this week with the UN envoy who is responsible for all of West Africa, including the Sahel. Of course, the neighbors and we, and many like-minded, are extremely concerned about West Africa, the Sahel, and now the impact on coastal West Africa, which of course has been a big focus with the Global Fragility Act, giving us additional resources. When I was out in Accra, Ghana last month, we spoke with a number of the West African leaders about their concerns about what this means for Mali. We've seen 3 of the members of the Economic Community of West African States withdraw formally now. This is not going in the right way. UN peacekeeping or AU peace operations, this is part of the puzzle, but our bilateral U.S. work and our work with like-minded partners, not just on behalf of the people in Mali, but also others in West Africa, the Sahel, coastal West Africa. This is a very important priority.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam. The chair now recognizes Mr. Smith for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me just thank you again for your testimonies. You know, on one trip to South Sudan, I met with peacekeepers, but there were also some Chinese peacekeepers who were there. And it really struck me that at a time, and this had not happened yet, but obviously the Chinese, the PLA is a brutal human rights violating force, as is their police. We know that Xi Jinping has said, show no mercy to the people in Xinjiang. That's his words, and he has a genocide. He just went through the Universal Periodic Review, deployed a 60-member delegation. They intimidated or tried to many of the delegations from other countries that are on the UN Human Rights Commission. I'm chairing a hearing on it tomorrow as chairman of the China Commission to point out what a sham he was involved with. But you know, the truth is hard to suppress, and he was even claiming they have religious freedom in the People's Republic of China. Nothing could be further from the truth. My concern always with the PRC is first and foremost for them, the Chinese people, the oppressed, and Xi Jinping and company are the oppressor. The secondary concern is the malign influence that they have on others. I had the hearings against WTO, ascension of that country at the WTO, claiming at the time, and I think I was right, that they would change WTO, and they loved their norms are not ours, our principles are not theirs, and they have done that. You know, so having peacekeepers deployed in Africa, particularly in areas where there are large numbers of Muslims, when they are simultaneously butchering, putting into concentration camps, forcibly aborting, and doing all kinds of genocidal acts every single day, when much of the world looks askance and doesn't do much about it. My question is, what, frankly, do you see the People's Republic of China and their, you know, their continuing work in Africa? What are they doing vis-a-vis the African peacekeeping? Are they trying to become a part of it? Are they, you know, what are they playing in the role in Addis? Do they have a contingent there? And again, I would be very wary of that, and maybe Ambassador Pratt, you might want to take that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've observed, as you have, PLA contributing personnel to peacekeeping missions. My experience in observing that over the years has been that they're trying to gain knowledge and experience through those missions. I think that question is in many ways separate from Chinese influence on the continent writ large, which is largely commercial and through contracts and investment in infrastructure. A quick comment on that. Those types of projects are 100% financed and based on debt. And I think that's probably the largest aspect of the relationship that the PLA has and the PRC has built with African countries in recent years. But on the peacekeeping front, I've seen more in terms of participation in missions as a way of information gathering and knowledge acquisition.
There's another aspect, sir, if I have a moment. You know, when China, of course, on the Security Council, is there negotiating these mandates for the peacekeeping mission, they are offering, really pushing on trying to deprioritize the human rights or sex and gender-based violence protections. During that mandate, if they can't get it done in the Security Council, they go to the Fifth Committee, the Budget Committee of the United Nations to try to chop out the budgets for these, and we push back against it. That's what we're there for. We are really pushing on this.
But one last thing, are the people you're working with at the AU, do they understand that this is a force that is riddled with human rights abusers, and we're worried about the South Africans that were just sent back? What happens when they get a greater foothold and they become, you know, a very, very important part of this peacekeeping operation run by the AU? Because I think it's dangerous as it can get.
I think the Assistant Secretary's answer that focused on the PRC pushing to change language in terms of protections on the concerns that you raised is probably all of the evidence that you need. And I think the AU would see that as well. I will say that this UNSCR has built into it the language that we would want on protections in terms of missions.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Chair now recognizes Ms. Weil. 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. It's always nice when we can get a second round. And I just wanted to follow up on the Wagner Group, and there was mention, of course, in this testimony about what happened in Mali. And what I'd like to focus on is how our most successful peacekeeping case studies could help us bolster the international rules-based order that Russia so flagrantly violates. Can you, to the extent that you, and you don't need to repeat anything you've said already, but if there's anything more that you want to add on that, I'd love to hear it.
No, thank you for that opportunity. I mean, clearly this UN system, the international system, is under threat because we've got both the PRC and Russia aggressively marketing their new or not so new vision of a global order, you know, that's fueled by this authoritarian impulse. But, you know, in terms of peacekeeping, that is just one tool. We have got to keep insisting on good governance. We have got to keep insisting on anti-corruption. We've got to keep insisting on inclusive political processes and political dialogues. In these countries in which these peacekeeping missions operate, there is a whole UN country team working together. UNDP may be running a civil society support program. UN Women may be lifting up women's voices. UN ODC, the part of the UN that deals with not only counter-narcotics, but also counting corruption, may have an anti-corruption. All of this works together. We, the U.S., we're on these executive boards. We're of all of these UN organizations. We are in there setting the mandates, setting the rules of the road. They all have to lift it up together. Conflict prevention, peacekeeping, but this focus on governance and transparency cannot be understated. And I think that is, you know, if I've got one message here, we've got to keep ourselves at the table, at the head of the table, at these UN fora and these multilateral institutions, because the world is in trouble. A number of these African leaders and peoples have asked for our assistance with this new tool. We need to deliver, including on governance.
I have to say, I've long thought that that Africa is the place, the continent that we should, as a country, the U.S., be investing more in, and that we have overlooked, and in some cases, literally moved away from some investments in Africa for which we are paying the price of this involvement by China and Russia. And I really hope, as I said in the beginning, that we can move towards more robust and effective and influential U.S. engagement in this. So thank you. And did you want to add anything to that, Ambassador Pratt?
I would just say, as a former Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, I strongly support what you're saying. Over the years, that program has had budget challenges and has had to withdraw from a number of locations that I believe strongly we should go back to.
It's funny you should mention the Peace Corps. I met with them when I was in Kenya in August, and while at the beginning of this hearing, I made a note to myself about getting a Peace Corps recruitment session done at my largest university in my district. So what a coincidence, but
one of the most influential programs that we have. Yeah.
I think you're right about that. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to the committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of limitations. And let me just state for the record, everybody here recognizes the folly of isolationism. But there must be somewhere between isolationism and continuing to abet and be complicit with the direction that the United Nations is currently on track with. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.